I've never been the kind of person to believe in ghost stories, especially the ones whispered in the streets of Rio de Janeiro, always dressed up with a little extra drama and changing details every time someone tells them. But on a sweltering February night, while sitting in a corner bar in Copacabana with a cold beer in hand, I heard for the very first time about the so-called Hotel Atlântico Velho, a massive Art Deco building just a few blocks away that, according to the older locals, had been abandoned for more than 30 years. "Nobody goes in there and comes out the same," said a thin man with patchy stubble sitting next to me. His voice was low and tense, as if he were afraid the building itself might overhear him. Another patron, older still, nodded gravely and added, "If you value your soul, stay away. At night the windows light up on their own, and they say it's not electric lamps doing it." I almost laughed, chalked it up to the usual Rio superstitions mixed with barroom legends meant to spook tourists, but the seriousness in their eyes didn't feel like an act. I asked what had happened to make the hotel close down, and the stubbled man leaned closer, almost whispering. In the 1980s, he said, a string of mysterious disappearances had taken place inside. Guests, staff, even delivery men simply vanished without a trace. The final recorded incident was a whole family visiting for Carnival who checked in and were never seen again. The city sealed the building soon after, and it was left to rot. As the night went on and the beers kept coming, my curiosity began to itch at me like something I couldn't scratch away. Each person who joined the conversation added a fresh layer to the tale. The stench of mold that seeped through the chained doors, a shadow crossing the top-floor windows, or the sound of a live band playing in the ballroom during the quietest hours of the night. As a freelance photographer always looking for unusual urban backdrops, I couldn't help but think the place would make for a perfect photo series. The next afternoon, I decided I'd go there alone, just before sunset, to capture the facade before daylight faded. Walking through the busy streets of Copacabana with my gear on my back, I turned onto Avenida Atlântica and saw the hotel for the first time. It loomed above the surrounding buildings, its once elegant walls peeling to reveal layers of faded paint, rusted balconies hanging precariously, and broken windows reflecting the late sun like watchful, unblinking eyes. Even with the bustle of traffic and the flow of pedestrians around me, a shiver crawled up my spine. There was something about the building's presence, like it was aware I was looking at it, and it resented the attention. I moved closer to the front entrance, sealed shut with heavy, rusted chains, and noticed deep marks on the ground, as if something heavy had been dragged inside not too long ago. I snapped a few quick shots, but the longer I stared into those dark, empty windows, the stronger the feeling grew that someone or something was standing behind the glass, silently watching me. Then I heard it, a sharp crack from inside, like wooden boards giving way. My pulse quickened, but the stubborn, skeptical side of me won out. I would come back that night alone and see for myself what could possibly make this place so feared. What I didn't know was that by ignoring every warning I'd been given, I was about to open a door I'd never be able to close again. The night came faster than I expected, and with it, a heavy, humid air that clung to my skin as I made my way back to the hotel. Copacabana's usual noise had dimmed, less music from the bars, fewer cars on the road, and the street where the hotel stood felt almost unnaturally quiet, as if the city itself was holding its breath. I carried my camera strapped across my chest, a flashlight in my pocket, and the naive confidence that I was just going to take some shots of an abandoned building and go home. When I turned the final corner and the facade came into view again, the change was immediate. The building seemed darker than the rest of the street, its silhouette swallowing light instead of reflecting it. I stood there for a moment, trying to figure out how to get inside, when I noticed something strange. One of the side service doors, the kind meant for deliveries, was slightly ajar. It shouldn't have been possible. I'd seen those chains earlier in the day, and they'd looked solid, untouched for years. My heartbeat quickened, and I told myself it was just the wind, that someone had broken in before me, maybe a squatter or a thrill-seeker. Still, I approached slowly, my shoes crunching on bits of glass scattered across the sidewalk. As I reached the door, the smell hit me, an overpowering mix of damp wood, mold, and something else, faint but sharp, like rusted metal. I pushed the door open, and the hinges groaned, echoing down the dark hallway beyond. My flashlight cut through the blackness, revealing cracked tiles on the floor, wallpaper curling away from the walls, and old luggage scattered like its owners had left in a hurry decades ago. The air inside was thick and heavy, the kind that feels alive, as if it's wrapping around you. Every step I took sent echoes bouncing through the building, making it impossible to tell if I was alone. Somewhere in the distance, deeper in the hotel, I thought I heard a faint tapping sound, irregular, almost like someone's fingernails drumming on wood. I froze, listening hard, but it stopped just as quickly as it had started. Shaking it off, I moved forward, passing what used to be the reception desk, now covered in a thick layer of dust. Behind it, the wall was lined with brass key hooks, each one still holding an old, tarnished key with a faded number tag. My fingers brushed against one of them, and a shiver ran through me, not from cold, but from an inexplicable sense that touching it was a mistake. As I turned toward the grand staircase leading to the upper floors, a faint glow caught my eye. Up on the third floor, through the shadows, one of the windows was softly illuminated, like a candle flickering behind the curtain. I stopped breathing for a second. There was no electricity here. My logical brain scrambled for explanations. Maybe a homeless person with a lantern, maybe kids playing around. But deep down, I knew this was something else. The tapping sound returned, louder now, and coming from somewhere above me. It was steady, deliberate, almost like a slow knock. I tightened my grip on the flashlight and camera and began to climb the stairs, each creak of the wood sounding like a gunshot in the silence. With every step, the glow from the third floor grew brighter and the air colder. By the time I reached the landing, I realized I could see my breath. That's when I noticed something else. Faint shapes, like smudged silhouettes, moving just beyond the edge of the light. They weren't walking. They were swaying, watching, and though my mind screamed at me to turn back, my legs carried me forward, straight toward that impossible glow. As I stepped onto the third floor landing, the light that had been flickering through the far window dimmed for a moment, as though it were reacting to my presence, and then flared again, brighter this time, unnaturally so. The hallway stretched ahead of me, lined with doors on both sides, their faded numbers barely visible through the layers of grime. My flashlight's beam wavered slightly in my trembling hand, slicing through the dust-filled air. Every few seconds, I thought I saw movement at the edges of my vision, a door shifting slightly, a shadow sliding across the wall. But whenever I turned to look, there was nothing. The tapping I'd heard earlier had become clearer now. 3 slow knocks, followed by a pause, then 3 more. They were coming from behind one of the closed doors halfway down the hall. My instincts screamed for me to leave, but my curiosity, my foolish drive to capture something rare on film, kept my feet moving forward. The floorboards groaned under my weight, and a damp, cold draft whispered along the corridor, carrying with it a faint smell of burnt wood, as though a fire had raged here long ago. I passed one door with its frame splintered, revealing a room inside littered with broken furniture and torn curtains. But my focus remained fixed on the source of the knocks. When I reached the door in question, room 308, I noticed something chilling. The dust on the floor outside it was disturbed, marked by faint footprints leading out into the hallway, and stopping right where I stood. Whoever or whatever had made them was no longer in the room. My mouth went dry. I lifted my camera, framing the door in my lens, when suddenly the knocking stopped, replaced by a long, slow scrape, as if something heavy was being dragged across the floor inside. I forced my shaking hand toward the doorknob, but before I could touch it, the door creaked open a few inches on its own. The gap was pitch black inside, yet I felt the weight of eyes on me. My flashlight flickered and then died completely, plunging me into darkness. The only light was that strange glow from the window at the far end of the hall, which now seemed weaker, as if it were being swallowed by the shadows creeping toward me. I heard a whisper, too soft to make out words, but close enough that I could feel the warmth of breath against my ear. I spun around, but the hallway behind me was empty. When I turned back, the door to room 308 was fully open, and the dragging sound was now in the hallway, moving toward me from the direction of the glow. My pulse roared in my ears, my instincts screamed to run, but my legs wouldn't respond, as if the air itself had thickened around me. Then just at the edge of the dim light, I saw it, a tall, impossibly thin figure, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, swaying side to side in slow, deliberate movements. It didn't walk, it glided. And with each sway, the hallway seemed to narrow, the shadows deepening until I could barely see the walls. That's when it stopped swaying and turned its head directly toward me, and I realized its eyes weren't reflecting the light. They were the light, two pale, flickering orbs burning in the darkness. The knocking resumed, but now it came from every door along the hallway at once, a cacophony of hollow echoes that made the floor vibrate under my feet. I finally broke free of whatever invisible grip held me, stumbling backward toward the stairs. But as I did, the figure tilted its head even farther, as if studying me, before stepping into the shadow and vanishing completely, leaving the hallway silent again, except for the sound of my own ragged breathing. I stood frozen at the top of the staircase, my back pressed against the cold, dusty wall, trying to convince myself that what I'd just seen could be explained. Some trick of the light, a hallucination brought on by the heat and the claustrophobic air. But my body knew better. My pulse hammered in my throat, my legs trembled, and the weight in my chest felt like it was pulling me deeper into the building instead of letting me escape. Against every logical thought screaming inside my head, I found myself stepping away from the stairs and back into the hallway, driven by something I couldn't name. Curiosity, recklessness, or maybe the hotel itself, tugging at me like an unseen current. The glow from the far window pulsed faintly now, as if it were breathing, and the tapping had stopped again, replaced by a low hum that seemed to come from the walls themselves. I walked toward the end of the hall, my footsteps echoing unnaturally, each one sounding like it came from somewhere behind me. As I passed the open door of room 308, the air turned noticeably colder, and I caught a glimpse inside. The room was empty, except for an old armchair facing the wall, its fabric torn, the stuffing spilling out. But in the dust covering the floor, there were new footprints, fresh, distinct, leading from the armchair to the doorway, and they weren't mine. A prickle ran down my neck, the undeniable sense that I wasn't alone, tightening around me like a vice. The hum grew louder the closer I got to the end of the corridor, and that's when I saw it. A single tall mirror leaning against the wall, its ornate frame dulled with age. My reflection stared back at me, but it wasn't right. The figure in the glass was standing perfectly still, even though I could feel my own chest rising and falling rapidly. Its head was tilted, just like the figure I'd seen before, and as I watched in horror, its mouth began to open slowly, impossibly wide. My breathing quickened. The reflection leaned forward, pressing a hand against the inside of the glass, and a crack spread across the mirror's surface, the sound sharp in the oppressive silence. Then the glow from the window flared again, filling the hallway with a sickly yellow light, and for the briefest moment I could see movement behind the reflection. Dozens of pale shapes, shifting and swaying, their faces featureless, but all turned toward me. I stumbled back, the mirror trembling on its stand, and that's when the hallway itself seemed to change. The walls warped slightly, the shadows deepened into black pools that seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat. The mirror figure's hand began to push through the crack, its fingers impossibly long and jointed at strange angles, reaching for me. I turned to run, but every door along the hallway flew open at once with a deafening slam, revealing nothing but darkness inside, darkness that seemed to pour out like smoke, filling the air with the same metallic scent I'd smelled when I first entered the building. The humming turned into a deep, resonant tone that rattled my bones, and somewhere within it, a voice, low, guttural, and almost inhuman, spoke words I couldn't understand. I didn't think, I just ran, my shoulders slamming into the walls as I sprinted back toward the staircase. But as I reached it, I realized something that made my blood run cold. The stairs were gone. In their place was a solid wall of cracked plaster, as if they had never existed. The hotel wasn't just haunted, it was alive, and it had just decided I wasn't leaving. The instant the staircase sealed into a wall, the hotel changed its breath. The low hum pitched upward into a shrill, glassy keen that made my teeth ache, and a draft rushed down the corridor as if the building had drawn a long inhale and was preparing to speak. Doors banged open and shut in a staggered rhythm. 3, pause 3, the same knock I'd followed to room 308, now multiplied and overlapping like 1,000 metronomes out of sync. I spun, searching for anything that resembled a way out, and my flashlight, dead seconds ago, sparked back to life for a single jittery flicker. In that strobe, I saw the hallway stretched longer than it should, an optical lie where the vanishing point kept sliding away, and I saw shapes rushing toward me from both ends, not quite touching the floor, not quite casting shadows of their own. Panic thrashed up my throat, and I did the dumbest, only thing I could think to do. I raised my camera and fired the flash. The burst smacked the hallway with hard white light, and the shapes recoiled, their edges smearing like paint underwater. For a heartbeat, the hotel seemed to glitch, walls straightening, the air warming by a fraction. Then the light died, and the world snapped back to the cold, to the iron taste on my tongue, to the whisper of something standing just behind me. I fired again. The flash carved a square of reality in front of me, and, in that square, a sign I hadn't noticed before appeared. Salão de Baile, second andar, with an arrow pointing left, the letters half-peeled but unmistakable. The instant the light faded, the sign vanished like a mirage, yet the arrow burned into my mind. My feet moved. I bolted left. The corridor bent into a short flight of stairs that shouldn't have been there a minute ago. As I stumbled down, music rose through the floor, low at first, then swelling into a full brassy swell that belonged to another century. A waltz, close and intimate, the kind of song that demands you lean in. The ballroom doors waited at the bottom, tall and mirrored, their glass panels fogged white from the inside. Behind the glass, silhouettes spun in slow circles, couples turning as if time had congealed around their hips. The moment my fingers touched the handle, the waltz stopped dead. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was a listening silence. I pushed the doors. They swung inward with a sigh, and a smell bloomed out, old perfume and wet ash, and the ballroom revealed itself in shivering candle-lit fragments, a cracked chandelier dripping with wax, tables skeletoned with rust, a parquet floor warped in waves like a frozen sea, and people, no, not people, arranged across the room as if they'd been surprised mid-dance and simply forgotten to finish the move. Their clothes were wrong for the decade, satin gowns that reflected no light, tuxedos the color of wet stone, and their heads tilted at that same angle, as if they were all listening to a joke they didn't understand. At the far end, on a raised dais, sat a band without faces, hands poised above instruments that hummed faintly on their own. I took one step in, and the candles nearest the door winked out. Another step. Another row extinguished. The darkness advanced with me like closing teeth. I raised the camera and fired. The flash flared, and in its afterimage I saw a family at the center of the floor. A father with his arms stretched protectively in front of a woman and a small girl clinging to his coat. The little girl's mouth was open as if mid-scream, but no sound came. The flash died. The room swallowed them. I took another step, and the band struck a single sour note that vibrated my bones. The dancers turned their heads toward me in unison, their faces still blank, and somewhere among them, one figure wasn't like the others. Taller, thinner, its eyes burning with that flickering candle glow I'd seen in the hallway. It didn't move its legs, it slid. The parquet buckled under its passage, wood swelling like something alive pressed from beneath. I backed up, boot heel catching on a raised seam, and went down hard, the camera skittering across the floor. The thin figure lifted a hand, and the mirrored doors slammed behind me, the sound so huge it felt like a physical shove between my shoulders. Breath ragged, palms stinging, I crawled for the camera. The band hit 2 more notes. Knock, knock, then a pause, then 3. Knock, knock, knock. And I realized it wasn't a song. It was the code that had led me here, the hotel playing itself like an instrument. My fingers closed around the camera, and I squeezed the shutter. The flash cracked the dark, and in that second of truth, I understood what the light was doing. It was not just illuminating, it was naming. Where the flash touched, the dancers resolved into details: a torn hem, a missing cufflink, a wedding ring jammed too tight on a swollen finger, and the thin figure flinched, its outline fuzzing at the edges like smoke in a draught. It hated being seen. I pulled myself to my feet, thumb hammering the shutter as quickly as the recharge would allow. Each burst shoved the darkness back a step, and in the staccato, I stitched a path across the room toward the dais. The family appeared again in those jigsaw frames, nearer this time, the father's eyes locked on mine in a plea so human it hurt. The little girl raised a hand and pointed, not at me but past me, to the wall beneath the balcony where the orchestra would have played in better days. Between 2 draped columns, where the candle glow failed to cling, a panel of wall was wrong, too smooth, too new, a rectangle of plaster that didn't match the rest. The next flash showed faint scuffs around its edges, as if fingers had clawed there. The thin figure unfurled its arm toward me, the air bending around that impossible reach, and the chandelier groaned above my head as if the room itself was straining. I ran for the panel, slamming my shoulder against it. It didn't give. I jammed the camera in my teeth, dug both hands into the gap where the plaster met the molding, and pulled until my nails burned. The band hammered the knocking rhythm faster. Doors around the perimeter flew open onto corridors that led only to black, and the dancers began to sway toward me in slow, sticky unison, like seaweed dragged by an undertow. I screamed, not words, just sound, and yanked with everything I had. The panel tore loose with a dry gasp of dust, revealing a narrow service passage lit by a single stale glow. No electricity, just a phosphorescent smear that made the air itself look bruised. Cold poured out. I didn't think. I dove in. The passage was barely wide enough for my shoulders, the walls sweating, the smell of rust so strong it tasted like blood. Behind me, the ballroom howled. First the chandelier, then the instruments, then the collective exhale of 100 knot breaths. Something scraped into the passage after me, a slow, patient drag, and the glow ahead pulsed brighter, then dimmer, as if matching my heartbeat. I kept the camera in one hand, firing blindly backward. Each flash exploded a frozen vignette of the thin figure wedged into the crawl space, its face inches from mine, eyes guttering like candle ends in a draught, mouth opening wider than the hinge of a jaw should allow. The passage sloped down. My knees banged, metal rungs bolted into the floor, ladder steps buried in silt, and suddenly I was falling, boots scrambling, palms skidding, and then I was spat out into a smaller room that might once have been a service pump station. Pipes webbed the walls, a rusted wheel valve crouched in one corner, and a hatch sat in the floor like a lid on a well. The thin figure pressed through the passage mouth but stopped, as if something in the threshold resisted it. In the hatch's reflection, a black mirrored circle of water, I saw the ballroom inverted above me. The dancers circling the hole in the floor that wasn't there anymore, the band leaning over their instruments, the chandelier's crystal tiers pointing up like knives. The wheel valve throbbed under my hand, vibrating with the building's hum, and stamped into the metal were words half-eaten by corrosion. Sprinkler main. A thought snapped into place. Water, Not blessed, not sacred, just water. A way to name the air, to flood the hotel with something it couldn't pretend to be. I braced both feet, grabbed the valve with everything left in my shoulders, and turned. It screamed, threads grinding, then lurched. Somewhere above, pipes coughed. The hotel shuddered like an animal taking a blow. The thin figure lunged, but the threshold held it an inch away from me, as if the doorway itself had rules it couldn't break. I turned the wheel again. It spun faster, loosened, and with a thunderclap like a storm breaking indoors, water exploded through the ceiling of the ballroom. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the candles died in a mass sigh. The music cut to a ragged wheeze, and the dancers stopped mid-sway as if the strings holding them were severed. The eyes of the thin thing guttered, then snapped brighter, furious, and the passage shook so hard dust cascaded down in sheets. I didn't wait. I yanked the hatch. Cold blackness gaped, the smell of the ocean pushing up at me, salt, rot, old stone, and a current I couldn't see tugged at my ankles as if the hotel itself were trying to drink. Behind me the figure forced one joint, then another, through the threshold, ribs popping like knuckles, and a voice, many voices, poured out of it at once, one word braided into 1,000. Stay. I dropped the camera into my jacket, sucked a breath that tasted like nails, and jumped. The well swallowed me whole. The world above pinwheeled into a white roar of water and screaming metal, and as I fell I heard, impossibly far away and right against my ear, the small, clear voice of the girl. Don't look back. Then the cold hit, and the lights, whatever passed for lights in that underworld, went out. Cold hit me like a shutting door. The fall ended in a brutal plunge that punched the breath from my lungs and folded the world into darkness and pressure. I kicked instinctively, arms thrashing through water so black it felt more like night-made liquid than any flood I'd ever known. When my head finally broke the surface, I gulped air that smelled of salt and rust and something old, like rope left to rot in a boathouse. The roar above was a muffled thunder, pipes shrieking, water hammering wood. The ballroom becoming an ocean, and beneath it, a lower vibration trembled through the stone, a heartbeat that didn't belong to anything alive. I spun in place, treading water, and the weak phosphorescent smear I'd seen in the passage resolved into a dull greenish glow limning a cavern's teeth. Archways, low and crooked, brickwork slick with algae, iron rings sunk into walls, some still holding frayed, water-worn cords. I wasn't in a well. I was in a cistern, an underbelly the hotel had hidden, a reservoir where the city's veins converged. The camera banged against my chest under my jacket, blessedly still there. I rolled onto my back, drew a deeper breath, and let the current take me. It tugged me toward one of the archways where the water lapped over a lip of stone into a shallower runnel. As I slid over, my shoulder scraped brick. Slime came away under my fingers like skin. I clawed forward until my boots hit the floor and I could stand bent double, water to my ribs. The glow thickened ahead, enough to sketch the corridor into existence. Low, barrel vaulted, with pipes threading along the ceiling like exposed bones. The hum was stronger here, a bass note you don't hear so much as where. I moved, boots sucking at the silt, one hand on the wall to keep balance, the other checking the camera. The body was soaked but intact. The flash-charged LED winked red, struggling, then steadied. I tried it. The burst stabbed the corridor with white. For a single harsh beat, I saw what the glow was hiding. Chalky handprints smeared along the brick at shoulder height, waterlines marking years on the wall. And between two ribs of pipe, a rusted service sign stamped in Portuguese, Drenagium Saída, arrow pointing right. Exit. The light died. The dark closed back in like a mouth. I went right. The air carried a new taste, fresher, colder, and the current pushed harder, gathering in a purposeful pull. That's when the first voice found me. Not a word, a breath, then the softest syllable shaped by a throat that wasn't there, a child's inhale before a question. I froze. Water dripped in a steady metronome from a joint above. Somewhere behind me, something bumped against the wall and slid away. "Don't look back," she had said. I kept my eyes forward and moved. Around the next bend, the corridor split. One branch tight and low, the other wider but choked with collapsed masonry. The sign, another warped rectangle of tin, pointed low and tight. I crouched, waded into the narrower throat, and the hum lifted half a tone, becoming almost, no, not almost, becoming music. A memory of the waltz, slowed until each note was a separate stone dropping into deep water. With each step, the ceiling pressed lower. The glow faded, then swelled again, not from a single source, but from countless thin films of living light. Lichen, algae, whatever it was, smearing the bricks. When the passage opened, it did so all at once, spilling me into a chamber the size of a small chapel. A rusted ladder rose from the far wall to a square of grating 30 feet overhead, and through the bars I saw a dim, foreign light. Not candle, not the hotel's breath, but streetlight, honest and ugly and human. My chest lurched. I splashed to the ladder and grabbed the bottom rung. It wobbled like a tooth. I tested my weight and began to climb. 6 rungs up, the metal squealed. 8 rungs up, the hum shifted. 10. Something touched my boot. Not a hand, not pressure, a temperature, a subtraction of heat that ran from soul to spine. I fought the urge to look. 11 rungs. 12. The grating above looked older up close, a lattice bolted into concrete that had drunk a century of leaks. I ducked my shoulder under it and pushed. It didn't move. I pushed again, harder. The bolts groaned but held. Below, water lapped. The subtraction of heat climbed my shin, my knee. I set my jaw, braced a boot against the wall, and rose another rung to get both hands on the center of the grate. "Come on," I hissed through my teeth. "Come on." Something in the chamber exhaled. The grate shifted a hair. I threw everything into it. Metal screamed, a bolt snapped. The corner lifted half an inch, then another. Air that hadn't been breathed in years kissed my face. And then the voice was at my ear, small, clear, exactly as it had been before I jumped. "Don't look back." I didn't. I wriggled one shoulder through the gap, then my head. Cold night pushed against my face. I tasted rain on stone, old oil, a ghost of exhaust. The subtraction of heat reached my thigh. I ground my teeth, shoved with my legs, and the grate lurched just enough for me to rip one arm through. Fingers found the alley's edge above, brick chipped and sandy, and I hauled. The grate tore skin off my back as I slid through, and for a second I hung there, half in and half out, caught at the hips like an animal in a trap. I thought of the ballroom's family, of the father's eyes, of the thin figure's hinge-cracking mouth, and I bellowed. Not fear, not language, just defiance, and wrenched. Something gave, not metal, not flesh, but the hold the place had on me, and I spilled onto wet pavement in a narrow service alley behind the hotel. The world was shockingly loud. Distant traffic, a scooter whining past the mouth of the alley, the slap of water from a downspout. I sucked air like I was drinking it. For 3 seconds I lay there, face to the sky, rain washing hotel water from my eyes, and believed I was out. Then the alley's shadows changed. It wasn't movement, it was alignment, as if everything nocturnal had just turned to look at me. The grate below my ribs rattled, not from my weight but from hands, or the idea of hands pressing upward. The hum climbed the ladder and entered the alley like fog. At the far end, where the alley met the street, a figure stood sideways to the lamplight, too tall by a head, too thin by a rib, its posture tilted in that listening angle. The streetlight guttered. The hotel hadn't lost me. It had followed. I rolled to my knees, grabbed the camera, and shot blind. The flash exploded the alley into detail. Graffiti layered in colors, a crushed beer can, the figure's face a smear where features should be, and in that instant, the spell loosened. I scrambled up, ran for the street, and the figure did not chase so much as keep pace without moving, as if the alley were a conveyor that rolled me toward it. "Don't look back," the girl said again, but a different voice braided through hers now. Older, tired, the weight of years in a single word. "Run." I did. The street burst around me with the indifferent life of the city. A bus sighing at a stop, 2 teenagers laughing too loud, a woman arguing into her phone. I shoved into the noise like a swimmer into surf, forcing myself sideways, across, away from the alley's mouth. When I finally dared to glance over my shoulder, the alley was empty. No figure, no hum, just darkness and rain. Relief came sharp and treacherous. I staggered into the neon glow of a bakery's open door and leaned on the counter, dripping, shaking, trying to arrange my face into something a person behind a register could see without calling anyone. The woman at the till looked at me, at my soaked jacket, at the camera I held like a relic, and asked if I was okay. I opened my mouth to say yes. What came out was, "How late are you open?" Because I wasn't going to my hotel. Not yet. Not alone. Not while the water still trembled in the pipes, like a throat clearing to speak my name. I stayed in that bakery for almost an hour, nursing a coffee I didn't drink, letting the fluorescent lights and the clatter of dishes feel like armor. Every time the door opened and a gust of night spilled in, my shoulders tensed. But eventually, the clock above the counter inched toward midnight, and the truth settled in. I couldn't hide in a pastry shop until sunrise. I needed a bed, a lock, a room with walls that didn't hum like the inside of a throat. My hotel was 4 blocks away. 4 blocks in the city should have been nothing. But as I stepped outside, the street felt altered. Too quiet for a Friday night in Copacabana, the air heavy and still despite the rain. The kind of stillness that happens when the world is listening. I kept to the main avenue, staying under the occasional pools of light thrown by the street lamps, camera strap wound tight around my wrist like a lifeline. Halfway back, I passed an alley and froze. It wasn't the same service alley I'd crawled out of. This one was wider, lit by a single buzzing lamp, but the smell that drifted from it was identical: salt, rust, and wet ash. My pulse stuttered. In the center of the alley, a thin ripple passed through the rain, distorting the lamplight like heat rising off asphalt. It wasn't heat. I took a step back, forcing my eyes away, pretending I hadn't seen it. That's when the reflection caught me. In the window of a closed electronics shop, just beside the alley's mouth, my own shape stared back, except my reflection's head was tilted, not mine, and its eyes burned with that faint, flickering light I'd first seen in the hallway of the abandoned hotel. I turned sharply toward the glass, and the reflection straightened its head, one hand slowly lifting as though to touch the inside of the window. The buzzing lamp behind me went silent. I didn't wait for the dark to catch up. I bolted down the sidewalk, my boots splashing through puddles, each step louder than it should have been. The sound chased me. Not footsteps, not an echo, but the hollow rhythm of knocking, the same pattern that had lured me deeper into the building. 3 knocks, pause, 3 more. My hotel came into view, its reception lit, a man in a faded polo shirt dozing behind the desk. I slammed through the door, startling him awake, and muttered something about the rain before taking the stairs 2 at a time to my room. The door clicked shut behind me, and I leaned against it, chest heaving, trying to convince myself the outside world was a barrier the thing couldn't cross. The hum was gone. The knocking was gone. I stripped off my soaked jacket, set the camera on the desk, and collapsed onto the bed. The sheets were warm, the air still, and for the first time in hours I let my eyes close. I don't know how long I slept, but I woke to darkness. Not the room's darkness, but the sense of it, the awareness of being watched. The air felt colder than it had when I fell asleep. I reached for the lamp and froze. In the dim outline of the window across from the bed, a shape stood perfectly still, tall, thin, head tilted. Its outline was darker than the night outside, and its hand rested against the glass as though it had been there for hours. My fingers fumbled for the camera, the strap tangling around my wrist. The flash popped once, blinding the room for half a second. The window was empty, but when the spots cleared from my eyes, I saw them. Wet footprints leading from the window to the center of the room, stopping just short of the bed. I didn't breathe. The footprints were narrow, almost delicate, the kind a child might make if the child had walked out of the ocean and stood on your rug to watch you sleep. Water steamed off them in the air-conditioned chill, beading and running into the fibers until the prints blurred at the edges. I kept the camera up, thumb hammering the shutter. The flash snapped the room into hard chemical daylight, and with each burst the prints gleamed fresh. No reflection, no trick of shadow, just fact. The next flash licked across the ceiling and caught something else. The faintest smear on the wall above the headboard, a hand dragged along plaster, 5 strokes of duller black. I followed the mark sideways to the wardrobe mirror, a cheap rectangle bolted to the door. My reflection wasn't alone. Over my shoulder, where there should have been empty air, stood a girl no higher than my ribs, hair dark and wet, head canted as if listening. She didn't exist in the room, only in the glass. I swallowed, forced my gaze to the mirror instead of turning around, and said, "I did what you told me. I didn't look back." The girl's reflection tipped her head the other way. Something about that tiny movement, a language without words, felt like approval and warning braided together. The flash recycled. I pressed it again. The girl's mouth shaped a sound I couldn't hear, and behind her in the mirror, the room's window brightened by a hair, as if some other source of light had just leaned in from outside. 3 slow knocks rolled up through the floorboards from the hallway beyond my door. I stepped sideways, keeping the mirror in my periphery. The knocks came again, closer, unhurried. I had the stupid thought that if I could get to the corridor, if I could force the thing into a public space, it would break a rule. I slung the camera, grabbed the door handle, and cracked it an inch. Cold air feathered my face. The hall was dark except for the exit sign's meager red. Down the carpet, 20 feet away, something leaned into the corner where 2 corridors met. Tall, thin, listening. It wasn't facing me, not exactly. It was turned to the wall, ear pressed close, as if eavesdropping on the building itself. I should have shut the door. I said, "Hey," because terror does not make you clever. The head rotated, slow, too slow, like the neck remembered how to turn only after the idea reached its bones. Those candle-glow eyes found the crack in my door. The exit sign sputtered. The red bled down to a dying coal. I slammed the latch, heart rattling. The instant the lock caught, the knocks resumed, this time on my window, not loud, polite almost, the kind of knock a guest gives when they don't want to wake the whole floor. The mirror showed the girl again, closer now, her small hand raised as if returning a knock I couldn't hear. "What do you want me to do?" I whispered, to my own stupidity, to a child who might be a memory, a warning, a haunt. She spread her fingers to show 5, then closed them to show 1, then pointed down, floor below. The camera's ready light blinked. I took a shallow breath and crossed to the window. The glass was cool beneath my palm. The city's reflection stared back. Sodium haze, rain-painted asphalt, the faint smear of headlights. In the reflection, the alley behind the building had company. Silhouettes arranged like punctuation. Commas, parentheses, quotation marks, swaying almost imperceptibly. I pulled the curtain. Nothing stood outside. The knock came again from the inside face of the glass. "Enough," I said, not to the window, but to the idea of it, and turned back to the door. If the girl meant 1 below, that put whatever I needed on the floor under mine. A service room, a breaker box, a valve, another exit, anything human. I pocketed the camera's spare battery, shoved my feet into wet boots, and opened the door. The hall's carpet muffled everything. My steps, my breathing, the tiny chafe of jacket against shirt. The listening figure had left the corner. Its absence felt like a chair recently vacated, indentation without occupant. I edged to the stairwell and pushed the bar. The door sighed open on concrete and dust. I moved fast. The stairs were raw and honest, no carpet to swallow sound. Every footfall dropped into the well and came back bigger. On the landing below, a lightless rectangle marked the door to the next floor. It stood ajar, a black line splitting the darkness. I listened. The hum I'd come to recognize threaded through the gap in a higher key, the hotel's voice, pitched into a question. I descended one more flight, put my shoulder to the bar, and slid into the corridor. The smell hit first. damp paper, and cold metal. The hall here was narrower, the wallpaper a different cheap pattern, the exit sign dead. Doors marched away on both sides, numbers in tarnished brass. Halfway down, a door was missing entirely. In its place yawned a service opening filled with a freestanding mirror, ornate, old, wrong for this budget hotel, its gilt frame bruised with age. It had not been there hours ago. You don't hang a ballroom mirror in a corridor by mistake. My mouth went dry. In the glass, the corridor was a fraction off, angles too sharp, the vanishing point a little too deep. The girl stood in the center of that other hallway, with her back to me, her dress stained to the knees like she'd waded through a dark river. She lifted a hand and pointed, not at the mirror, not at me, but at a door across from the glass. Room 207. I crossed, fingers skidding on the cheap knob. It opened without resistance into darkness that settled around my face like gauze. I kept the door propped with my heel and flashed the camera once. The blast showed a square room with a bed, a desk, an unplugged mini-fridge, and above the headboard, a framed evacuation map printed on cheap paper, the kind that shows little green arrows to the stairs and a tiny star that says, "You are here." The light died. I ripped the frame from the wall. Behind it, the drywall had been cut and replaced, a neat rectangle secured with new screws and a strip of paint to shade off the rest. A patch. I jammed the room key into the seam and pried. The strip popped. The rectangle came away like a lid. Inside, a hollow the size of a shoebox, and inside that, a leather-bound guest ledger, bloated from water, its edges furred with mold, its brass corners gone green. I pulled it out, and the air in the room changed temperature, the way a crowd changes mood. The hum behind the walls dropped until it was almost below hearing. I laid the book on the bed and opened it to the first page that would yield. Names crawled across the paper in elegant hand, dates marching beside them, 1982, 1983, 1984. The list ended mid-line, the ink washing into a brown storm, flood damage, then nothing. I flipped to the back. A different hand had scrawled a short note across the inside cover in Portuguese, barely legible under the stains. I didn't need every word to understand enough. Do not let the list end here. Keep a record. They cannot be unnamed. My skin prickled. The ledger wasn't a souvenir. It was a weapon, the same kind of naming I'd done with the Flash, a way to drag a thing into the world where rules apply. The corridor's hum rose again, offended. Something small moved in the dark near the door, no sound, just a change in the weight of the air. I lifted the camera, fired once into the hall, and the mirror across the way answered. The thin, tall figure stood in the other corridor, almost nose to the glass, its eyes burning low and steady. It raised one long finger to where its lips would be and made the idea of a shh. My heartbeat climbed into my mouth. I shoved the ledger into my jacket under the camera, stepped back into the hall, and forced myself to look at the mirror, not through it. The girl lifted her hand again, palm out, and pressed it to the inside of the glass. I matched it. The surface was cold. Very gently she leaned forward. For a stuttering second, the mirror wasn't mirror. It was water, held vertical. My fingers sank a fraction into that impossible plane and came out wet with something that wasn't entirely water, thinner, colder, threaded with a taste I knew too well now. Salt, rust, ash. The girl's gaze flicked to my jacket where the ledger bulged. She nodded, once hard, and then tilted her head toward the far end of the reflected hall where a fire door waited, propped with a brick. The door did not exist in my side of the world. The message did. Move. I went. I didn't run. The mirror hated suddenness. I walked with the slow, deliberate pace of someone crossing a thin river in the dark on stones that may or may not be there. At the stairwell, I paused, hand on the bar. The figure in the mirror was nearer now, close enough that the candle eyes guttered at the edges of their own light. It couldn't cross, not while the ledger rode my heart, not while the girl stood between us. But it could follow. Don't let the list end here, the ruined scrawl had warned. I pushed the stairwell door, and the concrete well accepted me like a neutral country. The hum thinned. Far below, somewhere in the building's buried gut, water still moved. I started down, ledger warm against my ribs, flash ready, each step another small, stubborn refusal to look back. The stairwell air grew warmer as I went down, but not in a way that promised safety. It was the kind of heat you find deep underground, heavy and stagnant, the kind that clings to your clothes and skin as if trying to slow you down. My boots struck each concrete step with a hollow thud that echoed endlessly, like the sound was descending ahead of me into some place far deeper than the building should allow. The exit signs stopped after the second sublevel, and the light from above dwindled to nothing. I had to rely entirely on my flashlight, which seemed to weaken the closer I got to the bottom, as though the dark here was thicker, heavier, eating the beam. At the final landing, the stairs ended not in a door, but in a wide, arched opening of old brick. Older than the rest of the building, the mortar cracked and furred with moss. A draft seeped through from the other side, damp and smelling of seawater. I stepped through and found myself in a long, vaulted tunnel, the kind of place built when no one worried about what sat beneath their foundations. Rusted pipes snaked along the walls, dripping at irregular intervals into puddles that shimmered faintly in the thin light. Somewhere ahead, water lapped softly, like breathing. The ledger under my arm felt heavier now, as if the thing inside these tunnels could sense it, maybe even wanted it back. My footsteps quickened despite my better judgment. The tunnel curved, and around that bend, the sound of the water deepened into a slow, rhythmic churn, like waves against stone. The flashlight's beam caught movement ahead, something retreating into the shadows just before the light touched it. I told myself it was a trick of the tunnel's shape, but my hands tightened around the camera all the same. At the end of the tunnel was another arch, wider and higher, opening into a cavernous chamber. Water filled half the space, dark and still except for the occasional ripple that spread from no visible source. The walls glistened, and faintly, impossibly, they reflected more than just my light, glimmers of shapes that shouldn't have been there, shifting slowly, as though the brick itself remembered every guest who had ever been lost in the hotel. On the far side of the chamber stood a door, massive, metal and chained from the outside. It was out of place here, too modern for the rest of the architecture, but what struck me most was the way it pulsed, subtly, like a muscle flexing under strain. My instinct screamed that nothing good was behind it, but I also knew without doubt that this was the center, the root of whatever the hotel had become. The water between me and the door was no more than waist deep, but the surface broke as soon as I stepped into it. Something pale and narrow brushed against my leg, gliding past, not in panic but in deliberate inspection. I forced myself to keep moving, camera raised. The first flash lit the chamber in stark white, and in that frozen instant I saw them, dozens of faces just below the surface, eyes open, hair floating, mouths working silently as if trying to speak through the water. The flash died, and the darkness swallowed them whole. My legs shook, but I waded on until I stood before the chained door. The ledger seemed to grow warmer, almost vibrating as I reached for the lock. It wasn't rusted shut. It was new, shiny even, and that's when I understood. Someone had tried to keep things in, not out. The girl's voice, faint but urgent, whispered right behind my ear, "If you open it, you can't close it again." The hum began in the water this time, deep and resonant, traveling up through my bones until my teeth ached. Behind me, the surface rippled outward in perfect circles, and in the distortion, I saw it. The tall, thin figure stepping across the water without breaking it, head tilted, eyes burning low. And still, I reached for the chain. My fingers closed around the chain, the cold biting deeper than the water lapping at my waist. The lock resisted for a second, and then, too easily, it clicked open, the sound echoing through the chamber like a gunshot. The chain slid free, links splashing into the water, and the hum rose to a fever pitch. The door shuddered once, twice, and then swung inward of its own accord. A wind came from the blackness beyond, but it wasn't air, it was the absence of it. A vacuum that pulled at my clothes, at my skin, at the part of me that dreams when I sleep. The smell of rust and salt was overwhelming, but under it was something far worse. The sweet rot of things that had been alive far too long in the dark. I raised the camera and fired the flash into the opening. For a heartbeat, I wished I hadn't. The space beyond wasn't a room. It was an expanse without walls, without a ceiling, a chasm lit by a sickly glow that seemed to come from nowhere. And in that endless space floated the hotel's stolen guests, every one of them, suspended in midair as if underwater, their limbs swaying in some unseen current. Their faces turned toward me in unison, eyes wide and wet, mouths working silently. The girl was among them, her hair drifting like smoke, her small hand raised in that same warning she'd given me before. The flash died, but their shapes lingered in my vision like afterburn. The hum became a voice now, many voices braided together into a single, unbearable word: stay. The tall figure stepped into the doorway, its candlelight eyes burning brighter than ever, the light now spilling over its shape and showing me what it truly was. Skin stretched too thin over bones that didn't belong to anything human. Joints bending the wrong way, ribs flaring out like the frame of a cage. It reached for me, its fingers impossibly long, tips dripping that same black water. I stumbled back into the waist-deep pool, my free hand groping for the ledger inside my jacket. The girl's voice, clear and sharp, cut through the chorus. Name them. Without thinking, I flipped the book open to the last ruined page and began reading the names, my voice shaking louder and louder until it was more scream than speech. Each name seemed to tear a piece from the figure, its edges blurring, its limbs twitching like it was being pulled apart by invisible hands. The water around me began to churn violently, the faces beneath the surface breaking through, gasping, vanishing again as if being yanked downward. The ledger's pages burned hot under my fingers. I shouted the last legible name, and the figure's light flared so violently it seared my eyes shut. The next moment the hum cut off entirely. Silence. When I opened my eyes, the door was gone. The wall was solid brick again, wet but unbroken. The water was still. I didn't waste a second. I splashed back to the tunnel, heart pounding so loud I could barely hear my own boots striking stone. The way out seemed shorter than before, my flashlight beam brighter. I climbed the stairs 2, 3 at a time, not daring to slow until I burst through the ground-level fire exit into the rain-soaked alley behind the hotel. The city noise crashed over me like a wave, horns, shouts, the hiss of tires on wet asphalt. I turned, half expecting the door to open behind me, but it was already rusted, padlocked, as if it had been untouched for decades. The ledger was still in my hands, soaked but intact. The names inside seemed to shift when I wasn't looking at them, new ink bleeding into the pages like the book was still writing itself. I thought about burning it, about leaving it in the gutter, but the girl's voice lingered in my head. They cannot be unnamed. So I walked. Past the hotel, past the street where I'd first heard the warnings, into the deeper noise of the city where no one would notice a man carrying a waterlogged book in the rain. I didn't look back, but even now, nights later, I can feel the hum sometimes, through the walls of whatever room I'm in the plumbing, in the way shadows gather near mirrors. And I know the hotel isn't finished with me. It's just waiting, because some doors, once opened, never really close.